The salt-heavy breeze brushed against my face as I leaned on the ship's railing, staring into the endless expanse of dark water. Beneath me, the ocean churned with a quiet ferocity that mirrored the storm of questions in my head. Murder has a way of unsettling even the most seasoned detectives, and this one was shaping up to be a puzzle that demanded my full attention. The victim? Captain Richard Hale, a man who had spent his life commanding vessels, only to meet his end aboard his own ship, the Neptune's Dawn. He was found slumped over his desk in the captain's quarters, a neat bullet hole in his chest, his face frozen in a look of shock. There was no sign of forced entry, no screams reported by the crew or passengers. A clean, professional hit, or so it seemed. I'd been on the cruise as a guest, a rare vacation gifted by my sister who insisted I needed a break. Funny how work finds you even when you're trying to escape it. When the ship's head of security learned there was a detective on board, I'd been asked, no begged, to help investigate. And I'm not one to refuse a mystery, especially one as intriguing as this. The first thing I noticed upon entering Hale's quarters was the smell gunpowder, faint but unmistakable, lingering in the air like an unwelcome guest. His desk was cluttered with charts, logbooks, and a half-empty glass of whiskey. Beside him lay a toppled photo frame, the glass shattered. I picked it up carefully, brushing away shards to reveal the image of Hale standing beside his vice-captain, Leonard Graves, both men smiling broadly against the backdrop of the Neptune's Dawn. I'd seen that kind of camaraderie before, the kind that could be genuine or a well-crafted facade. Detective Thorne? A voice broke my concentration. It was Officer Murray, the ship's head of security, a stout man with a perpetually furrowed brow. We've got a list of everyone who had access to the captain's quarters. Good, I said, slipping the photo into an evidence bag. Let's hear it. Aside from the captain himself, only 3 people had the access code: Vice Captain Graves, Chief Engineer Patel, and Stewardess Ellen Parker. I nodded, already forming questions. Who found the body? Graves, Murray said. He reported it at 6:15 this morning, said he went to check on the captain after he didn't show up for the daily briefing. I made a mental note. The person who finds the body often warrants closer scrutiny, especially when they're in a position of trust. Where's Graves now? In his quarters. I thought it best to keep him under observation. Good call. What about the other 2? Patel's in the engine room, and Parker's tending to passengers in the dining hall. All right. Let's start with Graves. Graves' quarters were on the same deck as the captain's, a short walk down a narrow corridor. The door was ajar when we arrived, and Graves was sitting on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands. He looked up as we entered, his face pale and drawn. Detective, he said, his voice shaky. This is a nightmare. I can't believe Richard is gone. I'm sorry for your loss, I said, taking a seat across from him. But I need to ask you some questions. He nodded, running a hand through his graying hair. Of course. Anything to help. When was the last time you saw Captain Hale alive? Last night, around 10. We had a drink together in his quarters before turning in for the night. He seemed distracted. Said he had something on his mind but didn't elaborate. Did anyone else join you? No, just the 2 of us. And this morning? When he didn't show up for the briefing, I went to check on him. That's when I found him. Like that. Did you touch anything in the room? Just his shoulder. I thought maybe he was still. His voice cracked, and he looked away. But he wasn't. I studied him carefully. His grief seemed genuine, but I'd been fooled before. Did the captain have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to harm him? Graves hesitated, a flicker of something. Fear? Guilt? Crossing his face. Not that I'm aware of. Richard was well respected. What about disagreements? Arguments? He shifted uncomfortably. Well, there was some tension between him and Patel recently. Something about maintenance schedules. But it was nothing serious. I filed that away for later. One last thing. Where were you last night between midnight and 6 a.m.? In my quarters, sleeping. Can anyone confirm that? He shook his head. No. I was alone. Convenient, I thought. But not unusual. Thank you, Mr. Graves. That'll be all for now. As we left his quarters, Murray turned to me. What do you think? I think, I said, we've got a lot more digging to do. Next stop, the engine room. If Patel and the captain had been at odds, I wanted to know why. But something about Graves, his hesitation, his carefully chosen words, stuck with me. On a ship full of people, secrets have a way of surfacing, and I was determined to uncover every last one. The engine room hummed with the steady rhythm of the ship's heart, a symphony of machinery and steam that made conversation almost impossible without shouting. Chief Engineer Patel was a wiry man in his 50s, with oil-streaked hands and a sharp, no-nonsense gaze. He straightened when he saw me approach, wiping his hands on a rag that only seemed to smear the grease further. "Detective," he said, his voice clipped. "I assume you're here about the captain." "That's right. I understand there were some tensions between you two recently. Care to explain?" Patel frowned, crossing his arms. "We had disagreements, yes, but they weren't personal. Hale wanted to push the engines harder to make up for delays, and I told him it wasn't safe. My job is to keep this ship running, not to bow to every whim." "Did it escalate?" "Not really. We argued, but that's part of the job. By the end of it, he backed down. Said he trusted my judgment." "Where were you last night?" "Here most of the night," Patel replied, gesturing to the engine room around him. "We had an issue with one of the turbines. My team and I were troubleshooting until about 3 a.m. After that, I went to my quarters." "Can anyone confirm that?" "My team can vouch for me until 3 a.m. After that, no. I was alone." "Do you know of anyone who might have wanted the captain dead?" Patel's eyes narrowed. "No. But if you're asking whether I did it, you're wasting your time. My hands are full keeping this ship afloat. I didn't have time to plot a murder." His frustration seemed genuine, but I wasn't ruling him out just yet. "Thank you, Mr. Patel. That'll be all for now." Next, I headed to the dining hall, where stewardess Ellen Parker was flitting between tables with a practiced smile. When she saw me, her smile faltered, and she approached hesitantly. "Detective," she greeted me, smoothing her apron. "I heard about the captain." "Awful, just awful." "It is," I agreed. "I need to ask you a few questions." "Of course," she said, leading me to a quiet corner. "When was the last time you saw Captain Hale?" "Yesterday evening. I brought him his dinner around 8 p.m. He seemed fine, maybe a little preoccupied. I didn't think much of it." "Did you notice anything unusual? Anyone acting strangely?" She shook her head. "No, nothing out of the ordinary." "Where were you last night?" "In my cabin, sleeping. I had an early shift this morning." "Can anyone confirm that?" She hesitated. "No, I'm afraid not. I was alone. 3 suspects, 3 alibis, none of which could be corroborated. But as I pieced together the fragments of their stories, one thing stood out: Leonard Graves. His hesitation, his subtle defensiveness, it all pointed to someone hiding something. I decided it was time to confront him again. This time, I wanted to push harder. Graves was in the bridge when I found him, staring out at the horizon. He turned when he heard me approach, his face unreadable. "Detective," he said. "What now?" "I need to clarify a few things," I said, my tone firm. "You said you were in your quarters all night. Yet no one can confirm that. And I couldn't help but notice your reaction earlier when I asked about the captain's enemies. You hesitated, Mr. Graves." "Why?" His jaw tightened. "I already told you. Richard was respected." "Respected doesn't mean liked," I interrupted. "You and the captain were close, weren't you? That kind of friendship can turn sour under the right or wrong circumstances." Graves said nothing, but his grip on the railing tightened. "You were the one who found him," I continued. "The one who reported the murder. And you had access to his quarters. Access that very few people had." His composure cracked, just for a moment, but it was enough. I saw the flicker of guilt in his eyes. "Leonard Graves," I said, my voice low, "what aren't you telling me?" He exhaled sharply, the weight of his secrets finally too much to bear. "Fine," he said, turning to face me. "You want the truth? Richard and I had a falling out. He discovered something. Something that could have ended my career." "What was it?" "I was skimming from the ship's budget," Graves admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't much, just enough to cover some debts. But Richard found out. He confronted me about it last night, said he was going to report me to the company. I panicked. I begged him not to, but he wouldn't listen. He said he couldn't trust me anymore. So you killed him." Graves' face crumpled. "I didn't mean to. I wanted to scare him, to make him see reason. But he wouldn't stop yelling, and I lost control. Before I knew it, the gun was in my hand, and he trailed off, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his confession. I signaled to Officer Murray, who stepped forward to place Graves in handcuffs. "Leonard Graves, you're under arrest for the murder of Captain Richard Hale." As Murray led him away, I stood on the bridge, staring out at the endless expanse of ocean. Another case closed, but the taste of justice was bittersweet. Murder never really ends at the arrest. It lingers, in the lives it shatters and the questions it leaves behind. But for now, at least, the storm had passed.